Hello, today is June 17th and it is currently 1 p.m. I'm Christine Wu with the Houston Asian American Archive, and I'm here today interviewing Dr. Tetsuo Ashizawa, also known as T, who is a physician and scientist focusing on neuromuscular medicine and neurology, and he is board certified by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. He also serves on multiple grant review panels, including NIH study sections, as well as was the executive director of the McKnight Brain Institute in the University of Florida and worked at the University of Texas Medical Branch and the University of Florida. Thank you for joining us for an interview today.
You're welcome, Christine. I'm looking forward to this interview.
Perfect. So first, we're going to start off with a few questions about your earlier experiences before you came to the United States. So where and when were you born?
I was born in Tokyo on September 11th, actually, in 1948. It's 3 years after the end of the war.
Did you stay there in Tokyo, or did you move around Japan when you were a child?
No, I was in Tokyo within Tokyo, we moved a couple of times, but essentially that was my activity area. I went to school in the next prefecture in high school and college. That's the Kanagawa prefecture next to Tokyo.
So, how would you describe the household you grew up in, and were they influential in helping you choose medicine as a career path?
Well, it's a long story. So when I was growing up, we were all very, very poor. And it's a post-war, so we had hardly enough to eat. And s- I remember that I was told to uh, cook this fish, and the fish is just only one fish, about this big, and we are using the charcoal, and I was using a fan, and then our cat came, took it away, and that was the only thing that we can eat with rice. So that night we didn't have anything else but rice. But rice itself was a luxury. The white rice was a luxury. So, but I vividly remember that instance, and my mother was not very happy, and she scolded me, next time you have to watch for cat. And so, I think, but if you're looking back, everybody was poor. Essentially, there are not much wealth, and there are not many materials sold. And we didn't have any money to begin with, but even if you had, it's difficult to find. And I remember I have a 3 year older sister. She's older 3 years more than I was. And so she, of course, had clothes, but I've never had a new clothes. And my mother uh, used the material, cloth material of my sister's clothes, and take it apart and made my clothes. So I had flowers on the pants and that kind of stuff, and it's quite eclectic. And those patches, those are standard. And we had shoes actually, and that was a good thing. But so that's my early childhood, but it was very peaceful because the war was over 3 years before I was born, and the surrounding area was uh, quite pastoral, and there are lots of nature and the rice field and other things. So my pastime as a child was playing with my sister and some other little kids, but by going to there are a bunch of ponds. The ponds were the water filling the bomb crater, because close to my home there was a manufacturer of the aircraft by the government. I mean, that's later on it became Nissan, the car company. So B-29 bomber of American Air Force dropped a lot of bombs, and we had a lot of craters and the water filled, and somehow with Americans, uh, American crawfish came. those are crawfish that you're going to eat. It just goes backwards. But the way we fished was very interesting. We had what is called surume, Surume. That's a dried squid, and you put the dried squid on the string, and um, have a fishing pole, and then throw it in, and then those crawfish will, with a pincer, they hang on and try to eat, and we can pull it out. And by the end of the day, you can have a bucket full of a crawfish. Now, so shamefully, we played with them, but we never ate it because at that time, uh, Japanese people didn't know how to eat crawfish. So retrospectively, it would be a good feast.
Wow. So it seems like you were very resourceful as a family growing up. Was that one of the values that they tried to instill in you growing up? And what were some other values?
Well, I think it's always the core thing is cherish peace. And so the peace was so valuable to my parents. Of course, I didn't know anything about war, but since everybody else was poor, we didn't feel that we were poor. We are the average, and our happiness is really remarkable. Decades later, I was talking to my mother. Now we have cars and television and refrigerator, air conditioning, etc., etc. And we our standard of living is much better. Then we talked about, well, but all those old days are really we are happy, and much better than now. It's sort of ironical. So I think my family's value is not revolved around materials or money, but it's the peace and happiness, and families helping each other. That was the most valuable thing.
That's very insightful. How would you describe the neighborhood you grew up in? Do you think they also had similar values? And do you think that the neighborhood shaped you? What was like that like?
Well, it is a little bit different story because post-war Japan, as you know, there was an economical miracle, they call, and that prosperity happened. But during the prosperity, of course, it's cannibalism, so to speak. The, the strong will um, exploit the weak and take advantage of them and start seeing the trend of the rich becomes richer and the poor becomes poorer and losers and winners. And so later on, it becomes more and more so and it became sort of uncomfortable. But fortunately, my family is typical middle class, although standard of living is not that great at that time. So we were happy, and in my neighborhood, the majority of the people are modest people, and very similar to our household. The father works in the company, and mother is a housewife, and two or three kids, and making a living. Nothing lavish, nothing really dead poor. So we were very happy in a way. That was a so to speak, ideal society. Yeah, but still, there are lots of problem in the society. Still, tuberculosis is one of the major perils, and people die from those. And so it's not as good as current standard, but happiness-wise, it was very interesting.
Thank you for that insight. You mentioned that tuberculosis was widespread at the time. Did that have anything to do with your choice to go into medicine? How did that impact your life?
Well, yes and no. So we all got what is called BCG. I think you may have heard of it as a immunization against tuberculosis. And so the tuberculosis went down. Also, antibiotics and anti-tuberculosis drugs were quite effective. So by the time I was in my teens, tuberculosis subsided. And so I clearly remember those medical threat. And also when we went to train station, that GIs of American Occupation Army, uh, what they did was that they have this little pushing pump type of thing, and that will create powder of DDT. That's the insecticide, because we were infested with the lice, you know, fleas and that kind of stuff. So that spreads the disease. So the disease was right. I mean, we grew up with those threat of the diseases. And so that influenced to some extent, but that was not my direct motivation to become a physician.
Okay, thank you for that story. I also have a few questions about what were your parents' occupations? Was you said that most people were the wives were housewives and the husbands went to the factory. Where did your father work?
So my father was in Japan. They call it salary man. That means you go to work and get envelope of money and come back once a month with money. And he was working on earlier some mining company, but he was an office worker. And then later on, he was working for Mitsubishi uh, industry company. And but he has never gone to really the executive position. He went barely the low management position. There's a story behind it because he was antisocial. Maybe to some extent, their in Japanese standard in that era, he may be a little bit of a sociopath. The reason why I say, I think he was a good man in my mind, and he has a high standard of moral. And but uh, when he was in elementary school, in his essay, he questioned the authority of emperor. Okay, and it was a pre-war. Militarism was very high in the place. So he wrote what he wrote was it's in Japanese saying that even fish head, if you worship, it becomes valuable. Appeared to be valuable actually. So he wrote that I think he was in fifth grade. Wrote that in the essay. So from then on, he was black marked in every single report, and particularly as a military officer comes to school and train school students for the military exercise. I mean, they really singled him out. And so he became even more antisocial because he hated those people. And then, so he was drafted, and he actually graduated from a very good school and college with I think he was top 2-3 percentile in the school when he graduated. But he refused when the war started. He refused to what do you call it in English? Become an officer. That's yeah. So the college graduates are recruited to become an officer, and he refused. So he went to Manchuria as a private, and then there he was talking to a lot of people, but his medical officer in the military identified that he is not I mean, he was an ordinary man, but he's smart. He was well read. So he said, Ashizawa, you need to go back to Japan. So he wrote the report of chest X-ray. There's a shadow and the tuberculosis, honorable discharge. So he was very indebted to that doctor, military officer. So, I think that was a interesting consequence, so that he never became uh, very high ranking in the society, even in the company. So he retired and he was not earning too much money. So when I went to college, I went to private college called Keio And that's a fairly expensive school. So they really squeeze the money out of that little envelope that he brings back every month. So I appreciate it very much. But luckily, my mother's father, my maternal grandfather, was quite successful. So he helped me and my sister. So the reason why I went to medical school is not because of those story related to medicine, but when I was in high school, I started getting very interested in science, particularly biology. And in high school, I went to university biology lab and dealt with fly, fruit fly. It's called Drosophila. Those are very interesting creature with genetic traits that we can study genetics and the metabolism that controlled by the gene. So I spent 2, 3 summers with a professor, and I never wrote a paper, but I enjoyed it tremendously. So I wanted to become a scientist. Okay. Now, so the school I was in high school was a private school already, and so it's automatically I can go to college if you graduate with a reasonable standing. So I was doing relatively well in the finals and everything, but to study science, you have to go to graduate school. Now, that high school and college, the Keio, at that time didn't have biology department. So I tried to take an entrance exam with a national school. It was the University of Tokyo and the Kyoto and that kind of place. As you know, those are highly competitive. Just in Korea, China, everywhere in Asian countries, those are extremely difficult to get in, as in Harvard or Princeton or you know, Caltech and, those Stanford, those country, I mean, in this country, those elite schools, the same thing. So I went to a prep school and I said, oh, forget it. I can't compete with those. So I was talking to my mother and my mother said, you know, if you want to do the biological scientific research, you know, your school has medical school, not biology, independent graduate school. So if you go to medical school and become an MD, you can do essentially everything that that biology PhD can do. So in the meantime, um, my sister was an excellent student. So she went into um, college and medical school. So I was inspired by that. And so I studied hard. And so I went into a medical school. That was the reason why. So my motivation, thank God in Japan, for the entrance of medical school, I didn't have to write an essay, beautiful story to steer my career into medicine. I had something like very sick friends, best friends, and tried to help him. I did a study and went into medical school. It's beautiful, but my motivation was to do biological research. So that was sort of a very different. But once I went in, I enjoyed the biological aspect of it and the scientific aspect of it. But in medical school, the primary goal is to make you a good doctor. And so I was exposed to the physician-patient relationship, how to approach what a humanitarian mission, and so on and so forth. And I really found myself um, really interested in that aspect of medicine. I think before I went into medical school, I was not mature enough to appreciate that. But during the medical school, I really developed that is really important and worthwhile things to do. So that's why I went to medicine and still continuing it.
Perfect. So when did you study at the Keio University School of Medicine?
So I went into the Keio, not university, but at Keio school. That started with elementary school. And I went into by taking entrance exam in junior high school, middle school. And so again, thanks to my grandfather, and he paid for it. And so I went all the way to medical school graduation in Keio.
Perfect. Okay. So you mentioned you were interested in biology and you learned several other things. So were those the main subject that you were interested in studying when you were in school?
The funny thing is that, so I mentioned about Drosophila fruit fly. I was really fascinated by genetics. And to this date, I'm still doing the genetics. So it's important for, I think high school students, um, if you are genuinely interested and fascinated by that subject, you can carry on and you can have a lot of interesting things in your life.
Yes, yes, for sure. So during your studies, do you think there were any defining or pivotal moments that sort of helped shape you into the person that you are today that you can think of when you're studying?
Yes, absolutely. So that in medical school, I had a best friend and who was an excellent student. And he had a photographic memory. He was really sickening, so smart. You know, I study hard and hard and hard and to get a good grade or passing grade. This guy never studies and he just remembers everything. He reads a lot. He goes to library instead of going to a lecture. He often says, hey, don't go to the lecture. They tell you outdated stuff. If you go to library, you can get the current stuff, the hot stuff. It's much better. And of course, I couldn't afford not to go to my class. They take attendance, but this guy has a lot of friends, and he writes a attendance ballot, to the teacher. But anyway, so this guy is really crazy. That uh, night before the final in medical school, everybody is supposed to be studying very hard. He calls me and said, hey, tomorrow it will be a very beautiful sunrise. Let's go to Izu, which is about, I would say 100 kilometers, maybe 70 miles away from Tokyo. Let's go there and look at the sunrise and then come back and we can come back in time for testing. So I couldn't say no. So from then on, I really studied hard before that test date comes up. So and then I pretend just I don't need to study either, but that level of the brain intelligence is totally different from him and me.
That seems like a very fascinating story.
Yeah. So that guy decided he was really fascinated by American medicine. So in Japan, even then, there was lots of influence of German medicine and then some neuroscience, French medicine. Uh, those are the top notch, and American medicine became really better and better. And he said America is a next place to go to learn the best medicine. So he talked me into that. So um, that's the reason why I came to the United States. I think so. He is a major influence, and the biology professor, when I was in high school student and did the study of the fruit fly, and this guy, he's now a surgeon, but those two people really steered my life career.
Wow, it's very insightful. Do you know where they are now, what they're doing, what they're up to?
Well, the professor died a number of years ago, But I think my best friend is still in Tokyo, and he didn't go into academics. He's studying medicine. I mean, he's practicing medicine. And I also have to say, my sister showed me the way to a medical school in a way, and my mother, of course. Yeah.
That's very sweet. I guess talking about medical school and the differences, can you share what you think are the similarities and differences or weaknesses and strengths between medical students in the US versus Japan? And sort of what are the key characteristics do you think make a good medical student?
So the United States, um, quality of the medical students are really great, and they study very hard. Otherwise, you don't pass. In Japan, to get into medical school, like many other Asian schools, but once you get into, like my story of the going to see the sunrise, I mean, you can have the luxury of that. But so before the testing, you have to study hard, but you have a lot of time, free time as well. And U.S. system is much more organized and much more comprehensive. There are not too many blanks and holes and in education. In Japan, it's hit and miss still. There are excellent areas and not so excellent areas. And evidence-based or scientifically based clinical practice much better in the United States. In Japan, it used to drive me crazy. And the professor said, well, this drug is said to be very effective in this condition. Now, that's in United States, it's not said to be. Right? They say this drug is effective, proven by this double-blind placebo-controlled study, or something like that. So it's a difference. So the sort of a stale guild system, the teacher tells student and students swallow everything the teacher says, and monkey see, monkey do, and sometimes without really critical evaluation of this, knowledge. So that was a very much different. That was actually 40 some years ago. Now in Japan, of course, they learn, and a lot of improvement happen, and they are not no longer doing that, but they are much less authoritarian, but they have to rely on the scientific evidence so that the US and Japanese medicine became much closer. And in some aspect, some fields, Japanese medicine is leading. And so was in China or Korea. I mean, they really prospered in certain areas. And um, so I think it's an interesting experience. I think in this global era, that will continue to become more uh, diversified, but at the same time, the standard will become even.
Yes, yes, very much so. So you mentioned that your friend inspired you to come to the United States after finishing medical school. Did some of your peers also want to come to the US? Were there any other factors in your choices?
Yes, there are about, I would say about 5% of the class came to the United States. And interestingly, all of them but me went back to Japan. Okay, they may have stayed 3, 4 years, but then eventually they went back. Um, Not in my class, but 3, 4 years below me, there's one person. He was a close friend of mine. Um, he is in California practicing in cardiology, and he is practicing, but at the same time publishing papers. So very interesting guy.
That's very interesting. So, when did you come from Japan to the U.S.? You said in your CV it's 1974, right? And when you
Uh-huh.
transitioned from medical school in Japan to your fellowship and residency here, did any of your family members come with you, or was it just you?
No, just me. So this was the first um, overseas trip for me. Surprisingly, I think that was exceptional, but I didn't come to United States for interview. I had a telephone interview. That's about it. There was no FaceTime or anything like that. They didn't know what I looked like in the motion picture. I mean, I sent a picture, uh, regular photograph. So, but they accepted me, and this hospital is called the Allegheny General Hospital in Pittsburgh. It's still there, and uh, but it was kind of scary. That first night, I still remember. I arrived in University of Pittsburgh. I mean, Pittsburgh Airport, and then my medical school's acquaintance's brother picked me up. But he was a banker, so he dropped me at the hotel, and that was called William Penn Hotel, and the kind of old hotel middle of downtown. And I haven't eaten all day, so I became hungry. But the guy who picked me up from the airport said, "Don't go out. Downtown Pittsburgh is dangerous during the night." But I was so hungry, and the hotel restaurant was closed. So I looked around, and there was an Italian restaurant across the street. It's not too far, just, I don't know, 40, 50 yards. So I walked fast and opened the door and went in. So it was an Italian restaurant, not a luxury, but typical red and white checker shape. I mean, pattern tablecloths, but those are plastic. Okay, and I sat down and I ordered spaghetti meatball. Okay, and so I was eating the dish, and then right next to my table there was a guy who had a long hair mixed with gray hair and very poorly dressed, and it sort of stunk a little bit. Didn't look like took a bath for 3, 4 days. So I was eating, and he started talking to me. So my English was not that great, but I replied everything politely, and smiled and asked and talked about family and where you grew up, and this kind of stuff. He apparently liked me, and this guy, the poorly dressed guy, bought me a glass of beer, and I was so moved. That was a great impression about the United States. Yeah.
That's very, very hospitable. So speaking of language, I suppose, what was the cultural transition like when you came here, and were there sort of challenges associated with that move?
Oh, absolutely. I think everything's different. I forgot to mention one thing is I was in U.S. Naval Hospital in Japan, and in that hospital environment, night and day we speak English, and uh, we prescribe American medicine, American names, and the prescription format is different. So you get used to that kind of stuff. So I was quite accustomed to that. So that in the hospital during the work, there was no problem. But when I went to cafeteria outside of the hospital, in the hospital that I was an intern, and usually that's free, right? And but outside during the holidays at night, you go to cafeteria, then you don't know the rule, where you pay and how you get the bill, and how you pick up the tray, how you choose the food, and that was everything was challenging. So monkey see, monkey do. Sometimes you can make a mistake, and the bank was terrifying because it's the money, right? And of course, there was no bank card or anything like that. You have to go to a teller and write down all those slips and account numbers and everything. And so I didn't know that. Um, this system is totally foreign to me, and so that was very, very scary. And then I had to buy a car, okay, because Pittsburgh there are certain public transportation, but not really great. So if you want to go out of town or something like that, just you want to have a car. So I bought a very cheap car, cheapest car, still brand new. I remember I was very proud of it, and but I didn't know that engagement at the showroom. That the car salesmen, they are very slick, fast talk, and that um, and essentially they try to get as much money out of me, right? So I have heard about that. So I was resisting, but I couldn't feel where I give up and where do I give in. And that was a very challenging thing. I still remember the guy was Italian, and whenever I negotiate to present another number, he mumbles the numbers in Italian, can't calculating, and he goes back to the manager and come back, and but it was very stressful. So everything is really challenging outside of the hospital. So indeed, in the hospital, I was more relaxed than outside.
It's very interesting. So you mentioned that you did have know some English before coming there. So how proficient with English were you before you moved here, and sort of how did you get accustomed to the specialized medical terms in
Yeah,
English?
so you can hear I have an accent and I have awkward expression. Still, my English is not 100% proficient. Okay, and my Japanese is no longer 100% proficient either. So, what language I speak, I don't know. But so it was a challenging taking history from the patient, or giving instruction to the patient. Those are relatively easy. But during the regular conversation, the greatest challenge was in the cafeteria in the hospital. You know those guys, but no, they're no longer speaking about medicine. They're talking about something else, politics or car or something, whatever it is. I just couldn't get into that. That was so frustrating and intimidating. So more intimidated, you don't speak, right? So it's more difficult to join the conversation. That was a real challenging situation.
Fascinating. So beyond just having cultural conversational differences, obviously you came to the US way, way, way after World War II. But did you feel different from other people in any sort of way? Did you feel like they didn't quite understand you because of that?
Oh yes, I think it's sort of interesting that there's a stereotype of Japanese, buck teeth, wearing glasses, and and so that kind of stuff. That many people came up to say, so that was it's sort of insulting at the same time. That's kind of funny. But Pittsburgh was really anti-Japanese, particularly. The reason is there was a U.S. steel and a lot of steel companies, and those companies lost a lot of jobs and laid off a lot of people because stiff competition from Japanese steel company. So they didn't like that, and uh, they had sort of a Japanese bashing in the news and that kind of stuff, and atmosphere was pretty similar to some people in the United States go against Chinese at the present time, and similar sentiment was there, and plus the war and Pearl Harbor. I think I heard a lot of things, and I remember during the grand rounds, which is medical conference among professionals and residents, and when the December 7th comes, I think, of course, they speak about that, and they um, gave a respect to the people who uh, perished in Pearl Harbor, and minister give uh, little prayers, and so that made me feel this big okay, during that time, and so there are certain uncomfortable uh, atmosphere. And then when you go to department store, you know, there are some Japanese product said made in Japan. Those are always looked cheap, looked poorly made. Okay, so there's nothing much to be really proud of. There are Sony coming out and some Toyota started making cars, but still quality. Few years later, Sony became fairly a household name, but at that time, in the very beginning, it wasn't.
Very interesting. So how did you sort of get used to the climate, and how did you sort of fall into the process of learning cultural references, learning how to engage with people in a new way?
Well, I think making friends and do things together, and you sometimes learn in hard way. Sometimes I was a laughing stock many times, but that's a great way to learn. How the things work in different culture, and yeah. But overall, I was very impressed that people are, in general, very kind. Every once in a while, you feel bashing and you feel hate feeling, and uh, but I think people are people, and if you are good to them, people are good to you. That's the basic philosophy value I learned.
Yes, the very good value of peace, like you said earlier. So you had this gap year when you were in Pennsylvania. So were there ever any other cities in the US that you considered coming to, or was Baylor College of Medicine a big deciding factor in coming to Houston?
Well, it's kind of funny thing that I didn't think about Baylor, and so I wanted to get out of Allegheny General. It's not a bad school. I mean, bad hospital for the training, but that I would like to go to better named place, just like anybody else. And so I talked to um, many doctors in that hospital as well as the naval hospital that doctors who trained me, and what place is good. And they said certain names, and I wrote letter to everywhere for the residency program, and not many things came back. And actually, breakthrough was uh, twofold through my connection with my alma mater, Keio's professor. And he was a neurology professor, and he collaborated very heavily with the chairman of the Department of Neurology at Baylor. So when I sent the application, he wrote me back and said, yeah, if you're from Keio and Professor such and such is trainee, you are more than welcome. And so a few months later, I was matched to Baylor. So that's the reason why I went there.
Interesting. So is that the reason that you chose to pursue, neuromuscular medicine, neurology in
No,
general?
I think neurology was always, I was interested in nervous system. And now I research and practice genetic disorders of nervous system. so, um, so I think that was a great choice, and that's what we wanted to do. And then I went into the neuromuscular disease because uh, system is much, can I say, scientifically approachable at that time. Brain is very complex black box. But for example, synapse, that's a neuron to neuron communication. The prototype of that is a neuromuscular junction. The nerve, peripheral nerve meets the muscle, and the nerve orders muscle to move. In order to do that, it uses a synaptic function, the release of acetylcholine, that's a neurotransmitter, from the presynaptic terminal to muscle. The muscle has a receptor, and then electric discharge happens and contract. And so my first uh, interest was a disease called myasthenia gravis, and that's a neuromuscular junction disease. There's auto antibodies against that postsynaptic muscle side receptors and corrupt that transmission. So I view that as a prototype of the brain synaptic transmission. And later on, of course, I was interested in, the rest of the nervous system. But it was a very good introduction and made a lot of sense. I learned a lot from that.
Wow, that's amazing. So you're also pretty big. You had this international clinical research effort for understanding spinocerebral ataxia, right? Which is a pretty big project, right? You mentioned that a lot of your collaborators were in the US and Europe with the European Ataxia Study Group. Do you think collaborators with researchers from outside of that, like potentially Asia, would be a future form of involvement?
Oh, we already interact with Asians. And, actually, I am, what do you call, a guest professor of one Chinese medical school. And I went there at least 4 times, and we still co-publish with a professor there. And I've seen patients in the hospital called Chanya Hospital. I think I pronounced it right, but anyway. Um, so Ataxia network is expanding. I know some people in India, some people, of course, in Taiwan and Korea and Japan, number of them. And even some people in Poland and Russia, I know some people, investigators. So now we are doing that initiative called Global Ataxia Initiative, or AGI. I think that was instigated by a German professor. And so we already collaborated with in the study that you mentioned already, as an NIH-funded transatlantic study. So he invited me to this Ataxia Global Initiative. That includes South America, that includes Australia, and so it becomes global because ataxia is a relatively rare condition, and so to get enough people, enough investigators, and also particularly in the clinical trials, we need a critical mass of the patient population. So that's a very valuable initiative, and international communication, friendship, trust, that kind of things are very, very important.
That's beautiful. So this you've had a very storied career. So what are you most passionate about in your career, and what parts are the most fulfilling to you?
Well, I don't know. That's a very good question. But as I said before, money was not my goal. And well, actually, fame is not my goal either. And it's sort of a self-satisfaction in a way. It's a sort of a not really a big ambition, but I would like to do good things, you know. And if I can contribute, that's great. And so if uh, money comes and fame comes as a result of that, that's okay. But those are not my primary goal. But I'm in the luxurious position, and I have a license, medical license, and training. And in medicine, if you're a practicing physician, you can't be that bad. So it's easy for me to say, money and the fame is not my primary goal, and I want to do the good thing. But if you talk to a number of different people outside, well, different background from me, I mean, that's totally unfair statement. I understand that. So that part is, I'm very happy that I chose medicine and I'm doing what I really want to do and helping people. And at the same time, having comfortable life and a certain respect. That's really the highlight.
Thank you for that response. You are a practicing medical practitioner, and your office lists that you can speak both English and Japanese as by you or the staff. So has this dual language presentation been useful for potentially other Japanese American immigrants or those who are potentially more proficient in Japanese?
Yeah. So most of the Japanese American immigrants, they speak better English than I do. Okay. Um, but sometimes the people from Japan, um, sort of a sent from Japan, Japanese headquarters to Houston. I mean, they contact me, which is a special uh, situation, the disease, for example, ataxia or some other neurogenetic disorders. Um, they contact me, and in rare cases, they actually flew from Japan to see me. It was surprised me because there are a lot of very famous Japanese professors in this field, and so they could have seen them, or they may have already seen them. But I felt very honored.
Great. So, do you have any? You wrote a lot about, your career in your form. Do you have any special hobbies or groups outside of work that you invest your free time into? What do you like to do in your free time?
Free time, let's see. I when I was younger, I loved skiing, snow skiing. But in Houston, there is no snow. So that was difficult. When I was in Pittsburgh, it's every third night on call. But second night after post call, I always went to hour and a half away from city of Pittsburgh. There was a small slope called Seven Springs. And somehow I still remember the big billboard said, world famous Seven Springs ski resort. I've never heard of it. But anyway, so that was my enjoyment. They have a nighttime skiing with a light. So that's why after work I could go there and ski. But I as recent as a couple of years ago, I went to Colorado and uh, other places, Utah, California, etc. But as you age, I start fearing about breaking bone. I remember the Pope, John Paul II, was doing very well. And then one day he broke his hip in skiing. And since then, his health and even mental capacity went south. So I would be very careful. And nowadays, so I run, probably 3 times a week, 5K. Until recently, I used run 10K or 15K, but the distance is getting shorter and time is getting slower. That means it takes longer. So I can't wake up early enough to run before my work. And so I picked up another hobby that is golf. Golf is very difficult, and it's essentially all here, right? And so it is tough, but I enjoy it. But recently, um, I went to this northern Houston uh, golf course, and of course, my ball goes all over, right? So I hit into a tall grass. Next day, I developed this rash. So I just uh, went to a doctor for Lyme disease because those rash became very angry and almost like a bullseye rash, which is known to be caused by Lyme bug called malaria. Um, so they run all the tests and that kind of stuff. So golf is, I thought, not dangerous sports, but not necessarily totally safe.
Well, did you get your results back? Are you okay?
Well, I'm okay. I started taking antibiotics and I should be okay. But um, yeah, it's an interesting experience.
Wow. So, well, what does your social circle consist of? Is it mostly, your family? You still keep in touch with people from Japan, maybe peers from Baylor?
Oh yeah,
Um,
all of the above.
yes.
It's yeah. Well, COVID was a challenging time, like everybody else. It's not easy for you to get out and have drinks, for example, or even dining. It's difficult. Even within the family, just we used to go out to eat during the weekend, but that's gone.
Well, hopefully things will come back sometime soon.
Mhm.
So, how did you sort of bridge establishing yourself here with your family and your ties back home? And how did you sort of choose to root yourself here?
That's an interesting question. So I tried to go back to Japan, and there was there were a couple of times a job offer. So I interviewed there, but it didn't work out pretty well because I think U.S. Um, work environment is pretty good, and particularly the U.S. work relationship is very business-like. In Asia, including Japan, that I call it, it's not doesn't translate well in English, but human relationship is wet, not dry, so that not business-like. So if somebody's daughter is getting married, for example, and you have never met that daughter or her future husband, but if I were invited, I need to go. I mean, in the United States, oh, I'm sorry, just I'm busy. That's it, right? So yeah, I think there's an adjustment, and I like the U.S. social rules. Uh, in regular circumstances, much better. But when there's something really challenging happens, that Asian society has very valuable quality of a human relationship, very strong tie. And that's sometimes in the United States, except for the very close friends, you know, it's among strangers, uh, not very tight. But having said that, you may have 2 seconds, 2 minutes. So my car was broken about 3 years ago, and just past a uh, railroad crossing. So it's stalled there. So I opened the trunk and the hood, and it was getting dark, and my cell phone's battery went down, and I couldn't call anybody. And car passing by, and offered me to call somebody, and uh, they called my wife, and so she was coming, but it was um, really getting dark, so I worried about it. Then this on the railroad track, there was an engineer just stopped that locomotive. He got down. He was watching me, and he took this lantern, that railroad lantern, and walked to me and said, "Here, you need some light, and you can have it. This is old, but still works." I mean, just isn't it nice? Just otherwise it's going to be pitch dark, all by yourself. So there are good things happening.
Yes, very much so. I guess I still do have a few more questions if you have the time to
Sure,
answer
yeah,
them.
I do.
So you mentioned, sort of the business cultural differences and other differences in that lifestyle. So as a first generation immigrant, have a lot of the cultural values and differences been an important part when you raise your children? And what do you specifically believe that you have given to your kids or have translated to them or they've taken up?
It's a good question. And first kid and last kid are totally different in relationship. The first kid you're excited about, of course, and last kid I was excited about too. But um, the expectation, you have an unreal expectation in the first kid, and it's totally unfair. And so relationship was, in a way, uh, I wouldn't call it tense, but it's very. uh, father-son relationship, typical Asian type. Okay, so the last one is I married twice, and so second marriage, and she's still very young, a teenager. So this one is just like I was acting like a grandfather, and she's a very independent thinker, and she uh, doesn't bother me. At the same time, she um, uh, oftentimes ignores me, and that's okay with me. And I love her to death, and it's really nice to watch with a little bit of space between and watching her growing up and as a mature person. That's very delightful. It's a different type of child raising. And so I have 4 kids and 4 grandchildren, and um, 3 of them are in the United States, and one is in Japan. He was born in States, but he decided to live in Japan. So that is kind of cool. And he complains that he is uh, obviously that he's half Caucasian, so that he stands out in Japan. His complexion is rather too light for the Japanese society. And he gets really mad because he's walking on the street and police stops him and said, "Where is your passport?" I'm a Japanese citizen. Doesn't believe him, It's really frustrating. And he feels it's much easier to be mingled in the United States than in Tokyo. But he at the same time loves Tokyo, loves Japanese uh, culture and foods and all those things. So and also people, I mean, my other kids in the States love to visit there and they live, visit Asia, and that's a luxury. It's really a great thing to have.
Wow, yes. So speaking of sort of different generations identifying, do you personally identify as Japanese, Japanese American, American, and how do your kids identify as
So
well?
I'm not naturalized. I'm Japanese citizen. That's my I don't know. So in Japan, if you if you naturalize in another country, you are supposed to automatically lose your Japanese citizenship. And I couldn't do that to my parents, whereas my parents are still alive. But my mother died about 4 years ago, so I have no obligations to keep that. But somehow, after all those years, um, most likely when I go back to Japan, some people say, "Wow, you haven't changed." But some other time, they say the same person said, "Oh, you're so Americanized." And people in the United States tell me the same thing. You know, wow, you really were accustomed to a U.S. culture, but at the same time, um, uh, what did they say? One of the persons said, "You can take a boy out of the country, but you can never take a country out of the boy," right? So, so that kind of thing. So it's a very complex feeling inside. But I kept my identity as a Japanese citizen. But I told my kids it's totally free to choose whichever, or to be, if you don't declare, even on paper, it says U.S. citizen. They don't revoke. The only problem is that to get to U.S. citizen, you need to have a current passport. So that's a little bit of complication. But many Japanese still do dual this citizenship after they grow up. I don't know exactly how they did it, but so it's my conscious effort to be Japanese, but at the same time, you may have sensed already that don't, I try to be a human being, before Japanese American or someone, what have you. Those things are not really important to me. I'm proud of my heritage, and I like the culture I grew up in, but that is not really the point. You know.
Yes, very much so. As you mentioned sort of earlier in the interview about the sort of rising anti-Asian sentiment in the pandemic, obviously, people don't really don't know the difference, right? But how do you feel as part of the Asian American community here, or at least someone living here? Have you felt that those sentiments are an important part of how you identify as part of this, or have you sort of engaged in any of that?
Okay, so that was a real cultural shock. I think I didn't mention, but Japan is a very homogeneous society, right? And nowadays there are a lot of foreign people living in Japan, and I really didn't have any concept of so-called prejudice or hate or racial discrimination or anything like that. And some people say that the Asians have things against uh, Africans, because of skin color change. But in Japan, all those African people are very, very successful and very well read. So growing up in Japan and talking to those people, I had a different bias that the average African American more well read the rest of the people. But then I found out that, this, I knew that intellectually. I read newspaper and everything. So um, poverty issues and other things that you really feel with your skin, then you understand there is a real threat of the discrimination against race. And so when I came to United States, I didn't feel like I was a minority because that I was out of Japan. But over the years, yes, you feel. And also just listen to, not only read, but listen to people who fought against the discrimination in California, for example. And uh, it's really eye-opening. I think uh, I'm not really try to promote, what can I say, um, it's anti-racism, but it's not, I don't like certain people in the social sector who exercise that kind of discrimination feeling. I mean, they're entitled to an animal field, a world. I mean, if you look different, they try to outcast and that kind of stuff. That the normal psychology, but I think we can intellectually overcome those differences. And after all, I feel, it's a human being is a human being, and we can develop a good relationship and a very pleasant world you can make.
Yes, for sure, for sure. So oftentimes, medicine, for example, is assumed to be somewhat of a universal constant. Saving and improving lives is the mission, no matter where you practice. Do you find that to be true? And do you find that oftentimes many Asian Americans in the medical field are very respected? So do you think that sort of has an impact on bridging cultures?
Uh, yes, medicine is very important, but at the same time, I feel very guilty. Um, my teenage daughter, she adores Doctors Without Border. Okay. Now, if somebody asks me, and do I abandon everything and go to war-infested zone and join them? I didn't, and I am not going to do. I feel guilty about that, and I respect, admire those courageous people. And medicine should be like that, and it's easy to say ideal. So I think I feel there are certain limitations that everybody carry, and but it is also important. Not everybody can be doctors without border, and you have to do what you can do where you are and now. So I think that is an important thing.
Yes, you have a very special expertise area, which very much so, very respectful, and you are helping people where they are, which I find very respectable. So, speaking more about sort of this memory of identity, I suppose, do you have any specific hopes for future generations of your family, especially since you have, children in Tokyo as well as states? Do you have any specific cultural aspirations or aspirations for them? I guess in that
So
sense.
absolutely, I think it is interesting. My current wife is a Chinese from mainland, and uh, my next door in the office, my next door office is a faculty. She was Korean American from California, and I have friends from India, a lot of collaborators, and one person from Bangladesh just asked me to write a recommendation letter for the promotion to associate professor. And there are a number of different people from Asian countries, and and but at the same time, people from Europe do the same thing. South America, they do the same thing. And but I feel close to other Asian people, and it's uh, we have certain disadvantages and advantages. For example, not many Asian people are tall. Some Indians are tall, but just East Asians particularly. And so, according to some statistics I read, uh, the height is important for the social success. Okay, I mean, that's clearly maybe the true in American society. And so it makes me smile that if when Asian people with a short stature is doing very well, it makes me smile, for example. And so I love to go to Asian festivals, and um, it gives me after all that we had thousands of years of cultural exchange in a regional area in East Asia, and that's very precious. And I think we have a commonality among us. So even the Indian people, I mean Sanskrit, and through the Buddhism, we understand certain concepts, and that was interesting to carry on the conversation to compare and that kind of experiences. And Koreans and Chinese, there are lots of words are common. Just I found out what they call denwa, telephone. It's a sort of a universal Eastern Asian language, and linguistically it's very interesting. But at the same time, from genetically speaking, um, the diversity, the differences in the different regions of Asia. That's also fascinating. And so I enjoy and I feel all Asians are in the same family that I belong to, and uh, we collaborate, develop friendship. I think that's a great thing to do.
Yes, very much. And just a few more minutes of your time. I
Yeah.
guess you mentioned that you sort of have this difference in identity between feeling wanting to still be naturalized as a Japanese citizen versus being in America. Could you elaborate sort of on your memories or your conceptions of that dual identity?
Yes, it's a more like in my case, and I think many immigrants' case, to some extent, it's physiological. Okay, when I was young, I could eat everything. I can go anywhere. And I was not afraid of anything. As you get older, the food preference goes regress, and more and more, I prefer white rice over bread. Okay, I still like bread. I buy French bread and that kind of stuff. I like pasta, but particularly when you get sick, you want to eat white rice or something like that. And so I go to grocery store, Japanese grocery store, Asian grocery store, at least once a month, something like that. And so that's sort of a physiological memory, of the body. And the culture is to some extent to that nostalgia, comfort, air. That's an important aspect. Although, if you calculate your molecular turnover of your body, most likely I'm 99% American molecule made.
That's very fascinating. Yes, I have heard the statistic. Anyway, but thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to answer these questions. I found them very fascinating. And again, thank you so much for your answers. And we will follow up with an email and the transcript. So,
Okay, I hope it's helpful, and I'm looking forward to your article.
yeah, thank you so much for your time. This has been great.
Okay, thank you.
Bye bye.
Take care.